Everybody, welcome to week 7. This week we're going to talk about evidence-based practices, and I think this is a really nice follow-up to our focus last week on the predictors of positive post-school success. And just your awareness of the predictors and how important they are in helping students have positive post-school outcomes, and how you can embed those into students' transition plans, their transition services, and courses of study. And now we'll kind of focus on, well, how do we use curriculum and programs and structures to implement those predictors? So those are called evidence-based practices, and we're going to go over that. And then I'm going to share with you how to find some of those curriculum and programs on a particular website that I'll do a walkthrough with you. But I think today's session is going to be relatively short. You're probably not too upset about that, because I know the last few ones have been a little longer than I'd hoped. I get going and I end up talking longer than I think I'm going to. So let's see if we can keep this week relatively short. So let me start my slides. Again, we're going to talk about evidence-based predictors. And I'm not sure in your other coursework if you guys have covered a lot of this evidence-based predictors just in general for students with disabilities, but we are definitely going to focus around evidence-based practices for transition. But I'm also going to point out some resources that I think might be useful for just other evidence-based practices in special education in general, so not necessarily in transition. But our learning intentions really for this week are that hopefully after the reading and the resources in this lecture, that you will be able to explain why it's important to know about and use transition practices that are grounded in research. So, there are a lot of programs out there, and people will probably tell you, this is what we've always done, or use this. But remember that there has been a lot of research done around what we know works with certain student populations for transition practices. And so we want to make sure that the things that we're using to teach students are grounded in research. And then our other learning intention for this week would be that you will know where to find these evidence-based practices. Oh, and I realize I wrote that wrong. It's EBPs, not EPBs, so ignore that. But EBPs is evidence-based practices that align with those 23 predictors. So we talked a ton last week about the 23 predictors, and you guys read about those. And now we'll highlight sort of, well, how do we implement those predictors? Where do we find resources and programs and curriculum to do that? So that's what we're going to focus on this week. So let's just go over again, what are EBPs? So they are teaching methods or programs, so curriculum in some cases, in most cases, that are supported by rigorous research to have effects that positively impact students. So they really are backed by research. And maybe you've heard of the doctor scenario, right? But like, if let's say you go to the doctor and you have some sort of a condition, you wouldn't want that doctor to just kind of prescribe you something that is not grounded or based on trials and research, right? And we don't want to do that as practitioners. So if you kind of think of that scenario of you want your doctor to really understand the research and know that what he or she is prescribing you is going to work, and it has been proven to work. That's the same sort of situation as, we as educators want to make sure that we are using practices and curriculum that we know has a research base and that will result in positive outcomes for our students, right? Otherwise, we're just kind of wasting everyone's time. So essentially, evidence-based practices take the guesswork out of teaching. So you don't have to try to figure out by trial and error what's going to work to improve student learning and student outcomes. So that's what evidence-based practices essentially are designed to do for you and for the students that you serve. So you might be wondering, how do I select appropriate evidence-based practices? Well, we first need to, figure out, understand who our audience is, right? So like if we are teaching students with more complex needs, or we're teaching students with particular disabilities, let's say autism, we would want to make sure that the curriculum that we choose is designed for that population of student. And I'm going to share resources with you where you can actually see certain curriculum that have been researched and tested with certain populations. So the first question is, what works, right? So the research kind of proves what works and what doesn't. For whom, so meaning again, what group of students, whether that be based on disability or age, and then under what conditions. So what is meant by that is, does the program have to be administered one-on-one, for example, or in a small group, or can it be in a whole class situation? Could it be in a co-taught class? Does it require more staff, time, and resources? So sometimes programs, are designed for one-on-one, and if that's not something that you have the resources for, then that might not be the right curriculum to implement if you can't do it exactly as prescribed. And then, of course, money is always an issue too, right? So there's some curriculum out there that's very costly, and that might not be supported by your district. And then can you implement it with fidelity? And so what that means is, if a curriculum says that it has to be implemented, 5 days a week, 30 minutes a day, and you only see these particular students 2 days a week for 15 minutes, then chances are you won't be able to implement that particular program or curriculum with fidelity the way that it was designed to be implemented, and you won't have the same results. So these are kind of all things I think questions you need to consider and before implementing a particular curriculum. All right. We use this word best practices a lot, or even effective practices, right? And so the question becomes, are they the same as evidence-based practices? Well, the short answer to that really is no, because best practices is not, it's not held to the highest quality of research. So, I mean, I'm guilty of this too. I use this word a lot, like, oh, that's a best practice, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean that's an evidence-based practice. So I think we just have to be careful that if somebody calls it a best practice, what is that based on? Is it really based on research or not? So if somebody, you're working with is saying, this is the best way to do something, I would dig a little deeper and find out for sure if that's based on any quality research or that's just somebody deciding. So that kind of leads me to the next bullet here, teacher pay teachers. I know that's a super popular place to go for teachers to look for ideas and curriculum ideas. And I'm not suggesting that is a terrible thing to do, but just be mindful, I think, of the fact that things that are on there that are created are not necessarily held to any kind of research or rigor. So just keep that in mind if you are looking for a curriculum that you really are trying to use to teach students to make progress or on their IEP goals, right? Teacher pay teachers may not be the best place to go to find that kind of thing. And then evidence-based practices may be backed by research, but not to the rigor. So sometimes an effective practice, it may have been tested, but it's just not quite the rigor of evidence-based practices. So I think when you're really wanting to see students progress in their IEP goals, you would definitely want to find out for sure if those effective practices are grounded in rigorous research before just, implementing it necessarily. All right, so here are some evidence-based practices for special education. Now, these aren't specific for transition, and a lot of these you probably already have had some coursework around or had some experience with, but we know for special education, when we are teaching students skills, whether that be in math or reading or writing, even behavior or functional kinds of skills, that direct instruction is a great strategy. Modeling, using different kinds of reinforcement, also response to intervention, or also known as RTI, which you're probably pretty familiar with, but that's that idea of the multi-tiered systems of support. So if a student is not making progress in the general education curriculum, we call that tier 1, then they might need a different intervention. And we go into tier 2 interventions. In some cases, we go into tier 3 interventions. So that's essentially what RTI is, right? It's taking these more tiered and targeted interventions to help students progress if the tier 1 is not really helping them progress in the general ed curriculum. And then self-regulation strategy. So There's a lot around having students be able to regulate, like kind of help them self-regulate and self-monitor their own behavior. Social skills instruction. I'm sure you all work with many students that you feel like definitely have needs around that. And then prompting. So you've probably had some courses around prompting hierarchy, either least to most or most to least prompting. So when we're teaching a student a new skill, we want to provide prompts, but then we want to fade those prompts, and there are different ways of doing that. And then task analysis, which is essentially taking a difficult skill, maybe it's something like hand washing, for example, and breaking that down into very small steps. And that's called a task analysis, and then providing prompts for each one of those. So if there are any of these that you have never heard of, I'd be happy to have a conversation with you about those if you feel like you need more of that. But we're not going to go into depth. I just wanted to kind of point these out. And maybe you can ask yourself too, like, how many of these do I use? How many of these have I had some exposure to and some instruction around? And if you feel that you haven't had that, then I can provide you some resources. And then co-teaching. I don't know if you all are in a setting where co-teaching is happening, but that is definitely an evidence-based practice. When we can have a gen ed teacher and a special ed teacher co-plan and co-teach a course. There's a lot of research that says that really produces great outcomes for our students with disabilities. So this is not the end-all be-all list. I have put in the Canvas course a more comprehensive list of all of the different evidence-based practices for special education. And it would just suggest that if you haven't had much exposure to that, that you definitely take a look at that so that you're aware of what those high leverage practices are. So the Council for Exceptional Children, also known as CEC, and many of you are probably members of that, maybe student members of CEC. It's our largest really professional organization for special education teachers. And they put out a lot of really great, not just articles, but resources. And they do have a website and also a book, a textbook essentially called High Leverage Practices, right? So you probably heard the term, don't work harder, work smarter. So if we're going to, put all these efforts into planning and teaching our students, we want to make sure that we are using these high leverage practices when we teach. There are 22 practices, and they are kind of organized under 4 domains. And don't get these 22 practices mixed up with the 23 predictors of post-school success, because that's really focused on transition only. These are just general practices for special education. And those 4 domains are based on, and they just kind of changed the names of these. So if you go to this website, those links are live there, where I've hyperlinked the 22 practices and the 4 domains. You can go there. And it might be organized a little differently, but they've sort of renamed them. So these 4 domains are collaboration. And this is kind of interesting because we talk a ton about collaboration being super important when it comes to transition, planning. But collaboration is important just in general, right? Like, so we want to always be collaborating with our general education teachers and school counselors and parents. So collaboration is just huge throughout our theme, I think, whether that be your elementary school, middle school, high school, and beyond, is definitely an evidence-based practice. And then data-driven planning. So really making sure that we are looking constantly at our student progress, what is the data telling us? And then how do we move forward from there? And then instruction and behavior and academics. So they put those together, but we recognize that obviously if students have problematic behavior or barriers in the areas of behavior, that's going to impact how they perform academically, right? And then intensify and intervene as needed. So that's the last domain. I'm not going to go into those in depth here, but you have the resources that I provided you and then these links, and I'll have these slides, of course, on the course so you can look at that. All right, so I am going to do a walkthrough, though, of where do I find these evidence-based practices specifically for transition. So I have, I think, talked about this before, the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, the collaborative. I know it's a mouthful, but we call it NTACT-C. And their website, you can Google NTAC-C, certainly, but the actual URL is www.transitionta.org. And again, those links will take you right there. But the website is great. There's a lot there, but the organization of it is a little confusing. So I'm going to stop sharing and then go to that page so that you all can see it. So I'm going to share a different screen and kind of show you how to navigate this. All right. I will say that the NTACT website does require a password, like a login. It is totally free. I suggest if you haven't done it yet that you go ahead and do it because it's constantly, they're adding things all the time. There's great information on here. So this is the home page for the NTACT website. And if you follow the prompts I put on that slide, essentially says to go to topics. And then from topics, we're going to go to effective practices. And we're going to click on that. And that will take us to this page on effective practices. Now, what I really want to point out is this PDF here, and it says download the effective practices PDF. So let's do that really quick. And this brings up a document. I'm going to try to make it bigger for you all. This brings up the effective practices in transition. So again, it's taking all those 23 predictors that we focused on last week and now actually listing curriculum, programs, practices that align with those predictors. So this is a really kind of a nice guide. And then it talks about which student population this has actually been tested on, right? So that the research has been around. So let's say I teach students with intellectual disabilities, and I am trying to teach a pretty large task, and I need to break that down into a task analysis. So that's called one prompting strategy is called backwards chaining. So if I wanted to implement backwards chaining, I know that that has been tested with students with intellectual disabilities, right? So there's evidence to say that using the strategy of backward chaining works with students with intellectual disabilities. If I'm teaching maybe students with autism, for example, right here, differential reinforcement. So differential reinforcement is defined as reinforcing only those responses within a response class that meet a specific criteria. So it's a way, we all like reinforce our students, but there are ways that we can do this very specifically. And this practice of using differential reinforcement has been tested specifically for students with autism right here, students with ASD. So what's I think really nice about this guide is you can, you could do a couple of things. You could start with this student population column and go down there and identify typically the students that you work with, right? So if it's students with OHI, other health impairments, or students with SLD, specific learning disabilities, you can see which types of programs and curriculum have been shown by research to have an impact, right? And really produce outcomes for those students. So I just thought this would be a very useful document of what's out there. If you can't find some of these, then you can certainly take the program that's listed on this left side, the practice itself, and Google that, or you could probably put that into the search window in NTACT and then find more information about that. So that is the effective practices PDF. That might be a useful place to go. Now I'm going to take you one more place. Again, we'll go to topics. We'll go to effective practices, and then we're going to go to, sorry, this is a little touchy. I'm going to go over to predictors of post-school success. So those are those 23 predictors we talked about last week. I'm going to click on that, and this should look familiar to you, but here's that nice kind of chart that we have of those 23 predictors that we talked about that are just so important that we make sure are happening in our settings for students with disabilities transition age. But let's say I want to work on goal setting. My students really don't know how to set goals, whether those are long-term goals, short-term goals. I want them more involved in their IEP, writing their post-secondary goals, for example. So I'm going to click, these are all live links. So I'm going to click on goal setting. And what it's going to do is pull up an entire page just for goal setting. And it's going to list the effective practices aligned with that predictor. So we know if we teach students the skill of setting goals, they're going to have better outcomes, right? After they leave us. But how do we do that? So here are a number of different types of curriculum that we can use. So you can click on these, self-directed IEP to teach student involvement. Maybe that's what I really want to do. My students just don't talk at their IEP meeting. I really want them to be involved. So I clicked on self-directed IEP to teach student involvement in the IEP meeting. So it describes the practice. It talks about kind of, some steps and what's involved in that. Talks about the research behind it, the references to establish the evidence base. So, what studies have been done. And then it gives me the actual link to go to that curriculum. Now, unfortunately, this link is broken. However, the Zero Center is out of University of Oklahoma, and they have really great curriculum. So even though this particular link is broken, if you were to just Google the Zero Center, just essentially copy and paste what's here, Zero Center for Choice Maker Curriculum, you'll be able to find it. It's just that the embedded link is broken right now, or the page changed or something like that. So I'm going to go back and see if we can maybe just pick one more. So let's say I also really need to work on students around social skills. So I click on social skills. It tells me all the effective practices that are aligned with that predictor, social skills. And then I can click on these different links here, and that will take me to video modeling. So if I want to teach a social skill, I used to do this a lot with my students where we would model like appropriate social skills with a video, and then I'd have them watch it. We would do behavior rehearsal. So in other words, before we got ready to go to a certain setting, I would expect them to have a particular skill that they would use, or particular behavior in that setting. And I would show them the video several times before going into that setting. So that's just an example of how to use video modeling, but there's a ton on video modeling for all different types of skills. So here you go. So and here's one on video modeling to teach laser skills, putting confetti on a table. So there's lots of ways that you can use video modeling. It's actually really effective, especially with students with more complex needs. And I would say students with autism benefit a lot from that visual video modeling. They also love watching videos, so it usually grabs their attention. So that is where you can find some of these evidence-based practices and predictors is on this page. Like I said, it's a little tricky to navigate. There are also something called on each one of these pages for the individualized predictors. So there's a link down here that says find lesson starters. And if you click on that, there's also this list of curriculum or lessons that you can choose from. So I would just suggest, spend some time on this website, because like I said, it gets pretty deep. But I just wanted to give you that quick walkthrough because sometimes it's hard to find. If when in doubt, you can always go to the search bar right here and put in what you're looking for, some keywords if you feel like you can't find it. But I highly recommend you check out that website for those evidence-based practices on on transitions specifically. All right, so let me get to my last slide. I'm going to share one more time. All right, so what I'd like you to do, let me go into slideshow mode. I think now that you have those resources and you've done the reading, I want you to also kind of reflect on your own practice, right? So ask yourself, what evidence-based practices are you currently using? And I would say in the context of transition, take a look at that, but also just in general in special education, if you look at the high leverage practices, just kind of look those over and then ask yourself, what am I using right now that's evidence-based? I mean, you may be surprised. You may be doing almost everything that you're teaching is evidence-based practices, which is great. But maybe there's room for exploring other evidence-based practices that maybe you had not implemented or thought about. And then the next question is, are you implementing those with fidelity, right? So that's the piece where, okay, am I doing this exactly how the curriculum has been designed to be implemented? So am I doing it number of days a week that the curriculum is outlined, and number of minutes a day, and with the right population? So I would kind of check yourself there also. And then what will you take back to the classroom now to improve your teaching? So now that you've had an opportunity to read more in depth about evidence-based practices around transition and also just special education in general, now that you've got these resources, what is at least one takeaway, something that you can take back to the classroom and start implementing right now, or in the near future? So I'd like you to reflect on that. And then next week, I'm really excited about, because we're going to start talking about student-led IEPs. And we've got some great tools that we have created at USBE to help you do that. And so I will see you all next week in week 8, and hope you have a great week. Again, I won't be doing my office hours on the 17th. That's a holiday, but otherwise every Monday I'm available from 4:30 to 5. And any other time, I have other time in my schedule. So if you would like to meet, please reach out, email me or message me in Canvas. I'd be happy to have a chat with you anytime or answer any questions. So with that, I'll see you all next week. Thanks, everyone.